Michael had always started his mornings the same way for as long as he could remember. Wake up before the sun, make a strong cup of coffee, sit at the small kitchen table by the window, and look out over the wide stretch of land that had been in his family for 3 generations. The farm wasn't huge, but it was his pride. There was a certain peace in knowing every inch of that soil, in being able to say exactly which patch was best for planting corn, which slope drained quickest after a rain, and where the rabbits liked to sneak in during the spring. That morning was cool, with a light fog hanging low over the southern field. Michael pulled on his worn boots, grabbed his cap, and stepped outside. The air had that earthy smell you get after a night of heavy. Dewey headed toward the south field because the irrigation lines there had been giving him some trouble the past week. One section had been leaking. He wanted to make sure it hadn't gotten worse. As he crossed the field, he noticed something odd out of the corner of his eye. Little orange sticks thin. Plastic markers were poking up from the dirt at regular intervals. At first he thought maybe they were from some old survey work, but these looked fresh. The soil around them was lighter, as if it had been disturbed recently. He crouched down, picked one up, and saw numbers printed on it along with the words fiber optic line, do not remove. He straightened up, frowning. Fiber optic. That was internet cable stuff, wasn't it? What on earth would that be doing? In his field? He started walking along the line of markers, and sure enough, they stretched across the land like some strange breadcrumb trail. His boots crunched on the hardened tracks left by something heavy, definitely not from his tractor. The tracks were wider, deeper, maybe a backhoe or a trenching machine. The more he walked, the more irritated he became. When he reached the far end of the line, he found a narrow trench that had been dug and then filled in. The dirt still looked fresh, darker than the surrounding soil. He kicked at it with the toe of his boot and felt the solid bump of something underneath, probably the cable. Whoever had done this had gone right through his property without saying a word. No knock on the door, no phone call, nothing. Michael rubbed the back of his neck. He wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but this didn't feel right. He knew the land boundaries well. This wasn't some gray area between his farm and the nearby housing development. This was smack in the middle of his south field. He turned slowly, scanning the distance toward the new neighborhood that had sprung up. Over the past decade, rows of identical houses with neatly cut lawns stood like soldiers in formation. That development was run by an HOA, and he had heard they were doing some kind of internet upgrade. But surely, they wouldn't just march on to private property. Like they owned it, right? Still, the evidence was all there. The heavy machinery tracks, the fresh dirt, the orange markers. He could almost picture the crew working here while he had been in town picking up supplies. The thought of strangers walking all over his field, digging into his soil, annoyed him more than he expected. Farming was more than just owning land. It was a relationship. He cared about this ground, had worked it with his own hands, and the idea of someone cutting into it without respect was personal. He decided to ask around before doing anything else. On his way back toward the house, he spotted his neighbor Earl, leaning on a fence post, sipping from a thermos. Earl was the kind of man who noticed everything in the county before breakfast. "Mornin'," Earl Michael called out. "Mornin', Mike. You see those cables yet?" Earl asked, a knowing smirk on his weathered face. Michael stopped mid-step. "So you know about this?" "Yeah, heard the HOA folks have been laying fiber optic for faster internet. It's been at it for a couple weeks. Guess they ran out of space on their side and came through here. Figured they had your permission." "They sure didn't," Michael said sharply. "No one asked me anything?" Earl raised an eyebrow. "Well, that's a fine mess then. You better go talk to M. Those HOA types don't think past their own fences." Michael muttered a thanks and kept walking, his mind spinning. So it was the HOA after all. And not just a random accident. They had deliberately cut across his field. The more he thought about it, the more it gnawed at him. If they could just take this much without asking, what else might they try in the future? Back at the farmhouse, Michael poured himself another cup of coffee, but barely touched it. He kept glancing out the window toward the field, picturing those cables running beneath the soil like uninvited guests. He wasn't sure if it was pure frustration or something. Deeper, but he felt this was about more than cables. It was about respect. The land was his, and you didn't just cross it like it belonged to you. By mid-morning, decided he wasn't going to sit around wondering. He grabbed his truck keys, drove the short distance into the housing development, and parked outside. The HOA's small office building. It was a neat little brick structure with a flag out front and a sign that read Community Office. The inside smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. The receptionist looked up from behind a desk and asked if he had an appointment. He didn't. I need to talk to whoever's in charge, Michael said plainly. She made a quick call, and a few minutes later, a man in a perfectly pressed polo shirt and khakis came out, smiling in that polite but not truly interested way that some people do when they think they're about to handle a minor complaint. He introduced himself as Greg, the HOA president. "What can I do for you?" Greg asked. Michael got straight to the point. "You laid fiber optic cables across my south field without my permission." Greg's smile didn't falter, but his tone was just a touch dismissive. "Oh, that's part of our community improvement project. The new internet service will be a huge benefit for residents." "I'm not one of your residents," Michael said. "And that's my land." Greg tilted his head. "We were under the impression there was an easement in place." "There's not," Michael said firmly. "I know my property lines." Greg gave a little shrug. "It's just a small section. You'll barely notice it's there." That was at the moment Michael felt his patience slipping. The way Greg brushed it off, as if it didn't matter, because it wasn't a big inconvenience, set something burning in Michael's chest. It wasn't about inconvenience. It was about ownership, rights, and the principle of asking before taking. They spoke for a few more minutes, but it was clear Greg wasn't going to take him seriously. Michael left the office with a sour taste in his mouth. As he drove home, he made up his mind. This wasn't going to be one of those situations where he let something slide just because it seemed like too much trouble. If the HOA wanted to cross his field, they were going to have to do it the right way or not at all. By the time the sun dipped low that evening, the peaceful calm of the farm felt different. The quiet wasn't as relaxing. Michael could almost hear the hum of the fiber optic lines buried under his soil. An invisible reminder that someone had crossed the line literally and figuratively. And as he stood at the edge of the south field, hands in his pockets, watching the last light fade over the land his father and grandfather had worked before him, he knew one thing for certain. They had started this without asking, but he was going to decide how it ended. The next morning, Michael woke up with the same uneasy feeling that had been sitting in his chest since yesterday. The first thing he did, even before his coffee, was look out the window toward the south field. The orange fiber optic markers were still there, bright and out of place against the soft brown of the soil. They seemed to mock him, as if saying, "We're here now. There's nothing you can do about it." But Michael wasn't the kind of man to just let something go, especially when it came to his land. He'd grown up watching his father stand his ground over things that mattered, whether it was a neighbor trying to move a fence a few inches into their property, or a salesman trying to push a bad deal for farm equipment. His father used to say, "A man who doesn't protect what's his will find himself with nothing left." Michael had always taken that to heart. He sat down with his coffee and a notebook. On the first page, he wrote in block letters, "HOA cables. Southfield," underneath. He listed what he knew so far. Cables had been installed without permission. Markers showed the line's path. No easement existed to his knowledge, and the HOA president had brushed off his concerns. He tapped the pen against the page, thinking, if there was an easement, it would be recorded somewhere official, probably in the county records. If there wasn't, then the HOA had no right to be on his land at all. The idea of walking into the county office and digging through dusty files didn't bother him. He actually liked that kind of work, quiet, methodical, like solving a puzzle. But he also knew it could take time. First, though, he wanted to see if the HOA had anything to say for themselves beyond what Greg had told him yesterday. Maybe they'd slip up and admit they'd made a mistake by mid-morning. He was back in his truck, heading toward the housing development again. The neat little brick HOA office looked the same as the day before, but this time Michael walked in with a firmer stride. The receptionist gave him the kind of polite smile that was really just a mask for mild annoyance. "Is Greg in?" Kella asked. She nodded and picked up the phone. A moment later, Greg appeared, looking as perfectly pressed as before. "Mr. Turner?" he said smoothly. "Back so soon?" Michael didn't bother with small talk. "Want to see the easement you mentioned?" Greg blinked, as if he hadn't expected Michael to follow up so quickly. "Well, I'm not sure we have a copy here in the office. It might be with the county records, so you don't have proof you can run those cables across my field," Michael pressed. Greg's smile tightened just a bit. "We operate under the understanding that the infrastructure is part of the broader community network. Sometimes these things cross property lines for the greater good." Michael felt his jaw clench. "The greater good doesn't mean you get to ignore property rights." Greg raised his hand slightly, as if to calm him. "Look, it's just a small section, and it's underground. You'll never even see it. We didn't think it would be an issue." There it was again, that dismissive tone, like Michael was being unreasonable. He could feel heat rising in his face, but he forced himself to keep his voice even. "I'll be checking the county records. If there's no easement, we're going to have a problem." Greg's polite mask slipped for just a second, replaced by something sharper. "Mr. Turner, removing that cable would disrupt internet service for over 200 homes. I'm sure you wouldn't want to cause that kind of trouble for your neighbors." Michael almost laughed at that. "You caused the trouble when you put it there without asking. I'll be in touch." He turned and walked out before Greg could say another word. The sunlight outside felt hotter than it should for a late spring morning. He got into his truck, sat there for a moment, and let out a slow breath. They were already trying to push him into feeling guilty, as if he was the one being difficult. That alone told him they were on shaky ground. On his way to the county records office, Michael thought about all the times big organizations tried to intimidate the little guy by making the problem seem too complicated to fight. He'd seen it before, with farm suppliers, equipment dealers, even banks. They always counted on people giving up because the process was slow or the paperwork was messy. But Michael wasn't easily discouraged. The records office was a quiet, cool building with shelves of thick binders and rows of computers for public use. The clerk behind the counter pointed him toward the section for property deeds and easements. Michael spent the next couple of hours going through digital maps, legal descriptions, and old documents scanned from decades ago. He found his family's original deed, the boundaries marked in black ink, the language clear about ownership. I checked every related record he could find. There was no easement knot for utilities, not for anything. By the time he closed the last binder, he felt a grim satisfaction. This was exactly what he'd suspected. The HOA had no legal right to be on his land. That meant he had the leverage. Now, they'd either have to remove the cables or come to him with an offer. On the drive home, Michael started thinking ahead. He could just tell them to take it out, but something told him that might not be the smartest move. Those cables had cost money to install, and removing them would cost even more. If the HOA really needed them, they might be willing to pay to keep them there. And if they were willing to pay, maybe this problem could turn into an opportunity. Back at the farm, he walked out to the south field again, this time seeing it a little differently. Beneath his boots, that buried cable wasn't just an unwanted intrusion anymore. It was a bargaining chip. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows over the markers. Michael stopped at one of them and crouched down, brushing the dirt from its base. He thought about how the HOA had just assumed they could take what they wanted, and he smiled to himself. They'd made their move without asking.
Ow.
Michael didn't sleep much that night. He lay in bed listening to the faint hum of crickets outside, staring at the dark ceiling, his mind running through possibilities. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those orange markers in his field. And Greg's dismissive smile wasn't just about the cables anymore, it was about the principle of it. They had walked onto his land as if it were theirs, and then tried to make him feel like he was being unreasonable for caring. By the time the first thin light of dawn crept into his room, if the HOA wanted those cables to stay, they were going to play by his rules. He wasn't going to storm into their office shouting or rip the cables out in anger. That would be satisfying in the short term, but messy in the long run. No, he was going to handle this carefully, step by step, so that when it was over, there would be no doubt he was in control. After breakfast, called a number he hadn't used in years, the office of Sam Dwyer, a property lawyer in town. Sam had helped Michael years ago with a boundary dispute, and Michael remembered that Sam had a sharp mind and a patient way of explaining complicated things. When Sam answered, Michael laid out the situation in plain terms. The cables, the lack of an easement, the HOA's dismissive attitude. There was a pause on the other end before Sam said, "Michael, if there's truly no easement, you've got no legal right to be there. That means you control access to those cables. We could send them a formal notice today." Michael leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I'm listening." Sam explained that utilities on private land without legal permission put the landowner in a strong position. Michael could demand they remove the cables, or he could allow them to stay under a lease agreement. In either case, the HOA couldn't touch those lines without his permission. "Just remember," Sam said, "don't block or damage the lines for now. That could give them an excuse to claim you're causing harm. But you can restrict access, lock things up, post signs, make it clear it's private property." That was exactly the kind of leverage Michael wanted. Over the next week, he got to work. The first step was figuring out exactly where the cables crossed his land. Using the markers and the trench lines, he traced the path, marking it on a rough sketch of his property. There was one spot right where the cable exited his land toward the neighborhood. That was perfect for what he had in mind. It was narrow, easy to secure, and close enough to the road that workers would naturally try to use it for access. Michael went into town and bought a heavy-duty steel utility box, the kind that could be locked and bolted into the ground. Also picked up a sturdy lock and a weatherproof sign that read, "Private property utility access by appointment only." The installation was hard work. The summer sun was already hot by mid-morning, and Michael's shirt stuck to his back as he dug into the packed dirt. He laid the steel box over the access point and secured it with thick bolts, making sure there was no easy way to get inside without the key. The sign went up right next to it, big enough to read from the road. When he stepped back and looked at it, he felt a satisfaction he hadn't felt in weeks. It wasn't aggressive, it was simply a statement of fact. "This is my land, and you need my permission to be here?" It didn't take long for the HOA to notice. 3 days later, Michael was checking the irrigation lines when a white utility van pulled up on the edge of the field. 2 men in bright orange vests got out, carrying tool bags. They walked up to the steel box and immediately stopped, staring at the lock. One of them pulled out a phone and made a call, speaking in quick, frustrated tones. Michael walked over, calm as can be. "Morning," he said. The taller of the 2 men turned to him. "We're here to check the fiber line. Got a service ticket." Michael gestured toward the sign. "That's private property. You'll need to schedule access through me." The shorter man frowned. "We've been coming through here for weeks." Michael nodded. "Yes, without permission. That's done now." Number 2. Appointment, no access. They both looked at each other, clearly annoyed. But Michael stayed polite and firm. "You can call the HOA. They know how to reach me." By the time the van drove off, Michael knew word would be traveling fast. He was right. Later that afternoon, Greg called him. The HOA president's voice was tight. "Mr. Turner, understand you've blocked our technicians from accessing the fiber line." "I've secured my property," Michael corrected. "You don't have an easement. Until we have a written agreement, no one comes onto my land." There was a pause, and then Greg tried the guilt angle again. "You're affecting service for hundreds of people." Michael kept his voice even. "Should have thought of that before you installed it without asking." That night, he sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the fireflies flicker in the distance. He thought about how quickly the balance of power had shifted. Just a week ago, he had felt like the HOA was holding all the cards. Now, they were the ones scrambling. But Michael wasn't done. He called Sam the next morning and told him he wanted to draft a formal notice to the HOA. Either remove the cables at their own expense or negotiate a lease to keep them in place. Sam agreed and said he'd have the letter ready by the end of the day. When Michael read the draft, he couldn't help but grin. The language was polite but firm, citing property law and making it clear that unauthorized access was trespassing. It also stated that any continued use of the land without permission would incur daily fees. Sam sent it off certified mail, ensuring there would be no "we didn't get it" excuses. The following days were quiet, too quiet. Michael knew the HOA was probably scrambling behind the scenes, talking to lawyers, calculating the cost of moving the cable, trying to figure out if they could find a way around him. He kept to his normal farm routine, but stayed alert for any movement near the south field. One evening, just as the sun was setting, Michael saw a car pull up by the gate. It wasn't a utility van this time. It was Greg's silver sedan. HOA president stepped out, walking toward the porch with that same stiff politeness. "Evening, Mr. Turner," Greg said, stopping a few feet away. "We received your letter." Michael nodded. "I figured you would." Greg cleared his throat. "Look, I admit we should have talked to you first. But removing that cable would be very expensive and disruptive. We'd like to discuss terms. For keeping it where it is?" Michael leaned back in his chair. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." In that moment, he realized the power had fully shifted. The HOA, who had acted like they owned the place just weeks ago, was now asking him for permission, and Michael knew that whatever happened next, he'd make sure the deal was on his terms. Greg's visit to the porch had been short, but the meaning behind it was big. For the first time since this whole mess started, the HOA president wasn't brushing him off or trying to talk down to him. He was there because he needed something, and Michael knew that was the best position to be in. Still, he wasn't going to rush it. He let Greg leave with nothing more than a promise that they'd talk soon. Michael wanted them to sweat a little longer. The next morning, Michael called Sam, his lawyer, to update him. "They came to me," Michael said, leaning against the kitchen counter with a fresh cup of coffee. "Want to discuss keeping the cables. That means they've already decided removing them is too expensive," Sam replied. "Don't agree to anything yet. Let's prepare your terms." Michael liked the sound of that. Your terms. Over the next few days, he and Sam worked out a proposal. The first rule was simple. Michael wasn't just asking for a one-time payment. If those cables stayed in his soil, they were going to pay for the privilege every single year. Sam suggested an annual lease fee, high enough to make it worth Michael's, while but still cheaper for the HOA than tearing everything up and starting over. The second rule was about responsibility. If the cable or any of their work crews damaged his crops, fences, or irrigation, the HOA would pay for repairs. No excuses, no delays. And third, any future work upgrades, maintenance, or inspections had to be scheduled at least a week in advance, in writing, by the time they finished. The agreement wasn't just a lease, it was a set of boundaries that made sure Michael stayed in control. No matter what happened with that line in the future. A week later, Greg called again. This time asking to meet at a local cafe in town. Michael agreed, but insisted Sam be there too. When Michael and Sam walked in, Greg was already at a corner table with a man in a suit, probably the HOA's lawyer. The table had a pot of coffee in the center and a stack of papers off to one side. Greg smiled politely.
"Ow.
Thanks for coming. Let's get straight to it. We want to find a solution that works for everyone." Michael didn't smile back. "Good. I have terms." He slid a copy of the lease proposal across the table. Greg glanced at it, then looked to his lawyer, who started reading. The lawyer's expression didn't change much, but Michael noticed the way his eyes slowed when he reached the lease fee amount. Greg shifted uncomfortably. "This is quite a sum," Greg said finally. Michael took a sip of his coffee, then removing the line. The HOA lawyer spoke up. "Mr. Turner, with all due respect, this fee seems..." Michael cut him off gently but firmly. "With all due respect, the cable is on my private property without legal permission.
Are you need?"
I control it. This is the rate." There was a long pause. Michael could feel Greg's frustration rising, but he stayed calm. He'd learned long ago that silence in a negotiation can be powerful. Let them feel the weight of it. The lawyer tried another angle. "If we were to pay this annually, would you consider lowering the fee for the first few years?" "No," Michael said simply. "The rate starts now. If you don't agree, you can remove the cable at your own expense. I'll give you 30 days to get it off my land." Greg frowned, clearly not liking the ultimatum. "You realize removing it would cut service to hundreds of people, right?" I didn't put you in that position, Michael replied. Did that shut them up for a moment? Finally, the lawyer leaned toward Greg and whispered something. Greg nodded slowly, then straightened up. All right, we can agree to the fee. But the maintenance access clause's too restrictive. We need more flexibility for emergencies. Michael looked at Sam, who gave a slight nod. Fine, Michael said, but emergency has to be clearly defined in writing. And even in an emergency, I expect a phone call before anyone steps foot on my property. No unannounced digging. They went back and forth for nearly 2 hours. Every time Greg tried to shave down the terms, Michael pushed back. He wasn't rude, but he was unshakable. Eventually, the lawyer stopped pushing the big points. They knew they were beaten on those. By the end of the meeting, they had a preliminary agreement. The HOA would pay the annual lease fee, cover any damages, and follow Michael's scheduling. Rules for access. In return, Michael would allow the cable to remain in place. Both sides agreed to have the final paperwork drafted and signed within 2 weeks. As they stood to leave, Greg tried one last attempt at friendliness. I think this worked out well for everyone, don't you? Michael just gave a small smile. It's fair, he said, then walked out with Sam. Outside, Sam clapped him on the shoulder. You handled that perfectly. They walked in thinking they could bargain you down. You didn't give them an inch. Michael felt a deep satisfaction. It wasn't just about the money, though. The lease would be a nice addition to the farm's income. It was about standing his ground, making sure they understood that his land wasn't free for the taking. Back at home, he filed the draft agreement in a folder on his desk and poured himself a drink. He thought about the first time he'd seen those orange markers and how angry and powerless he'd felt. Now, those same cables represented control and profit. They were still in his field, but now they were there on his terms. Over the next 2 weeks, there were a few small delays as the HOA's lawyer nitpicked the wording, but nothing that changed the core of the deal. Finally, on a warm Tuesday morning, Michael sat across from Greg and his lawyer in Sam's office and signed the final agreement. The sound of the pen scratching across the paper felt like closing a chapter. When Greg slid the signed copy back across the table, Michael noticed the HOA president wasn't smiling anymore. He didn't look angry, exactly just resigned. Michael guessed that Greg knew this was going to be an expensive lesson for the HOA. After they left, Sam leaned back in his chair and said, You know, Michael, this kind of leverage doesn't come around often. You turned what could have been a legal headache into a steady income stream. Michael nodded. And I'm not done yet. He didn't explain what he meant right then, but he'd been thinking ahead. If the HOA had to lease from him to use that cable path, maybe someone else could too. There were other internet companies in the area, smaller ones looking to expand. If they could share the same conduit, Michael could lease it to them as well. That idea stayed in the back of his mind for the rest of the day. The deal with the HOA was signed and sealed, but there might be another opportunity just waiting to be tapped. For now, though, Michael let himself enjoy the victory. The HOA had come into this thinking they could walk all over him. Instead, they'd walked out, paying him every year to use what they had taken without asking. The balance of power had shifted completely, and Michael intended to keep it that way. The ink on the HOA lease agreement was barely dry when Michael's mind began working on the next step. Most people might have signed the deal, cashed the first check, and called it a win. But Michael had spent his whole life looking for ways to make the most of what he had. Farming taught him that if you had good soil, you didn't just grow one crop and leave it at that. You rotated, you planted smart. You looked for ways to get the best yield year after year. That's how he started seeing the fiber optic cable not just as a single source of income from the HOA, but as a piece of infrastructure, something that could be valuable to more than one player. The cable wasn't just there to serve the HOA's neighborhood. It was part of a network, and networks could be shared. A week after signing, Michael was in town picking up parts for his tractor when he ran into Tom Jensen at the hardware store. Tom ran a small, up-and-coming internet company called Prairie Connect. They specialized in providing service to rural areas that the big providers ignored. Michael had heard they'd been looking to expand toward the next county, but their biggest hurdle was the cost of laying new lines. They chatted for a bit about weather and crops, and then Tom mentioned it. "We're stuck on this expansion plan," Tom said with a sigh, leaning against a shelf stacked with boxes of nails. "We've got everything ready, permits, equipment, but running new fiber through some of the farmland is going to cost a fortune." "Can't get the numbers to work?" Michael raised an eyebrow. "What if you didn't have to run new fiber? What if you could use a stretch that's already in the ground?" Tom looked at him curiously. "Whose line?" "Mine," Michael said. With a hint of a smile, they went for coffee after that. Michael explained the situation, how the HOA had installed the fiber across his field without permission, how he'd locked it down, and how he now had a lease agreement giving him full control over access. Tom listened closely, his eyes brightening as Michael talked. "So you're saying," Tom said slowly, "that if I had permission from you, we could run our signal through that line too?" "Exactly," Michael said. "The conduit's already there. You wouldn't have to dig a thing through my property. You'd just lease space for me to use it." Tom sat back, whistling softly. "That could save us tens of thousands of dollars. And make me some extra money on top of what I'm getting from the HOA," Michael added. They spent the next hour talking through the details. Michael would allow Prairie Connect to use the same access path for their fiber, with a separate lock on their portion of the utility box. In return, they'd pay him a yearly fee smaller than the HOA's, but still substantial. Agreed to have his legal team draw up a simple contract, one that didn't interfere with the existing HOA lease, but clearly gave Prairie Connect rights to use the space. Michael went home that evening feeling like he'd just planted the first seeds of a second harvest. Over the next 2 weeks, Tom's team came out to inspect the access point, measure the conduit, and confirm there was room for their cable. There was plenty of it. The day the Prairie Connect crew came to install their line, Michael stood by the edge of the field watching the activity. The white vans rolled up, workers in hard hats moved with quick precision, and spools of bright cable gleamed in the sun. It felt different from the first time fiber had been laid here. Back then, it had been done behind his back. This time, it was on his terms. By mid-afternoon, Tom came over, wiping sweat from his forehead. "We're all set," he said. "We'll be live in a week. Your first lease payment will be in your account tomorrow." Michael shook his hand. "Pleasure doing business with you." It didn't take long for word to get back to the HOA. Greg called Michael, his voice a mix of irritation and forced politeness. "I hear you've leased the conduit to another provider," he said. "That's right," Michael replied. "That's unconventional," Greg said carefully. "It's my property," Michael said evenly, "and our agreement gives me full control over it. If you check the contract, you'll see nothing prevents me from leasing it to others." Greg didn't argue, knew there was nothing he could do. Michael could almost hear the frustration through the phone. The HOA wasn't just paying him to keep their cable in place anymore. They were now sharing the space with a competitor. The irony wasn't lost on Michael. The very thing the HOA had tried to take without asking was now helping bring internet. 2 places their service had never reached. And the best part? Every year, both companies would be paying him for the privilege. Months passed, and Michael settled back into his normal routine, but with a little more breathing room in his budget. The lease payments covered equipment repairs, few upgrades he'd been putting off for years, and even gave him the freedom to take a few days off during harvest, something he hadn't done in a long time. One crisp autumn evening, it stood at the edge of the south field, the last rays of the sun turning the sky a deep orange. The grass swayed gently in the breeze, and somewhere beneath his boots, 2 separate fiber optic lines ran side by side, silent, unseen, but now a steady source of income. He thought about how different things could have gone if he'd ignored those markers the first day he saw them, if he'd believed Greg when he brushed it off as no big deal. He'd have nothing but someone else's cable running through his land for free. Instead, he had turned a problem into an asset and then doubled it. The lesson, he thought, was simple. Don't let anyone tell you what your land is worth. You decide that. And sometimes the things you never asked for turn out to be the most valuable if you have the patience to see the opportunity. Michael took a deep breath of the cool air, listening to the quiet hum of the countryside. In the distance, a Prairie Connect service truck rolled down the road toward another rural home. The HOA's neighborhood lights began to flicker on. Both were tapping into the same buried line beneath his feet. He smiled, not because of the money, though. That was nice, but because he knew he'd taken back control from people who thought they could take it without asking. They'd learned their lesson. And as far as Michael was concerned, the field was his, the cables were his, and the future was his to shape.